Welcome to Anatomy Physiology Bio 67A lab, and in today's lab we're going to go over the planes and the terminology we use to describe the human body. So why is it important that we go over anatomy, and why is it all this jargon? And you'll realize really soon that in this course, both 67A and 67B, it's all about vocabulary. It's just learning all these terms and being able to use them in your communication. So there's a few things that you got to start off with that is very significant. When you go into the hospital or you go visit a doctor, they do assessments. They look at your physical, and they're going to look at you in terms of just how you look, overall well-being. And one of the ways that a patient is presented to any physician or any kind of medical expert is an anatomical position. That means you're facing them with your palms to your hips, palm facing forward, and then your toes facing forward, and you're standing upright. So there's a standard position of the body that you want to have before you start pointing, dissecting, and analyzing. And then we can use different regions of the body and different planes to then cut up the body so that we can visualize it better, right? So it's a way to precisely diagnose, to locate areas of the body where maybe I have a pain in my lower abdominal pelvic region, right? Or if I have a pain in the upper right quadrant of your thoracic lumbar region. So it gives you an idea of pointing area so that you can be more accurate and be able to help the patient. So anatomical position is defined as standing, legs together, feet is on the floor, and then your palms are on the side facing forward, and then your feet is basically how this model is as you're looking at them. And whenever you look at any image, okay, so any picture that I provide you during the lab and any kind of image you see during the top hat, I always want you to remember, try to visualize whatever you're memorizing or studying anatomical position first before you look at any other view. All right, so when you see a skull, or if I showed you an arm, or if I showed you a leg, don't look at it from a lateral view or a superior view. Always have it anatomical position first before you start orienting and moving it around. And I'll show you this as we get closer to the bones and the muscle, because there are some things that you want to see three-dimensional, and it gives you more of a depth. And then there's also two terms we describe in terms of the body's position. Prone is facing down, and supine is going to be facing up. So we can also do that with your hands, right? So pronation, supination, where you can twist up and down. So these are just terms we use to describe how we can orient the body. And it's important because that can test whether or not the joint is working or the muscle is compromised. All right, so it's something to be aware. Now we also have directional terms. This is a little bit more based on kind of the direction of a patient. So when you look at this term, when you say something is proximal, right, that means it's closer towards the midline. When something is distal, that means it's further away from the midline. So the midline is if you were to dissect, right, split the person in half, just dot a little line here called the sagittal plane, and you cut the person in half. Anything that brings it closer to that midline, the dotted line, is considered proximal or medial. And then anything that is further away from that is called distal or lateral, right? So medial, lateral just means is it's inside or outside. Proximal, distal usually refers to limbs, so your arm and leg. Something is distal, so your feet is distal to the abdominal pelvic cavity, right? So that way you can describe it to somebody, that way they know what's going on. We also have superior, inferior. Superior is on top, inferior is on the bottom. Inferior usually means towards the feet or the ground. And then we also have the dorsal ventral. Dorsal ventral is a good one because usually dorsal ventral refers to animals on fours, like a dog or a cat. But the ventral will be the front part, and the dorsal will be the back part, right? The part you can stroke the back of the dog. But for humans, right, the dorsal ventral is very similar to anterior and posterior. So that's why ventral is similar to anterior, and then posterior is very similar to dorsal. And it's important because dorsal is where information enters. And how this applies to anatomy is all the nerves in our body enter the dorsal side, and then they exit the ventral side. We also have cephalic and caudal. Cephalic just means cephalon. That's the root word for the head. And then caudal means the lower tailbone, or the sacrum to the pelvic region where the tailbone fuses. So again, a lot of terms used to describe region, directionality, and in respect to the midline of the body. We also have superficial and deep. Superficial means on the outside, and deep is underneath that layer. It's more for muscle description. So you can cut the body up in many planes, right? So this is a picture showing you the different kind of planes that you can orient the body. And this is important because when you cut the body up in different planes, you can visualize organs and internal structures differently. So the transverse plane is when you cut it across, then you create uneven. It's an uneven cut. You have sagittal, which is cutting in the middle. And you also have parasagittal, which is basically splitting from top down, but it might not be even. So there's a small differentiation between parasagittal and sagittal in the sense that mid-sagittal, sagittal means in the midline, so you have equal halves, whereas parasagittal just means you're cutting it from top down. Okay, and then we also have frontal plane, which is from the lateral border across. So if you were to look at the skull, right, so imagine the skull, and I provided a picture of it where it's the sagittal cut, it would look very different than if it was in a frontal cut. And that's also why when you read your top hat, you will see different pictures of different views of different parts of the body. All right, so again, sagittal versus mid-sagittal versus parasagittal, and then we have coronal and transverse. So just different ways to cut the body and slice it up. So this is just an example showing you that if you had the small intestine or a tube in the body and you were to cut it in different planes, obviously it's a very different view. And when you look into any microscope, in later lab 3, lab 4, we're going to have a histology, and those are going to be all images of a smear of a cell. Whenever you look at a slide image in our class in the lab, just remember when they made these slides, right? So when they make a slide, right, this is a glass slide, and then before you make it, it depends on how they cut the specimen, right? So if I were to cut the specimen like this picture shows here, I cut this part and I smear it, it's not going to be like looking into the tube, right? So you can make a slide look very differently. So when you do look at those histology images later on, don't feel confused. Always ask yourself what you're looking at first, and then consider what kind of plane that might have been cut to create that slide. Okay, so there's a lot to think about. We also have body cavities. The cranial cavity is where the skull sits. We have the dorsal cavity, which is going to be in the posterior region. And we also have the ventral cavity, which is all the organs inside the upper thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity, so your heart, your lungs. And then we have the upper chest cavity, also not thoracic, and then lower ab cavity called abdominal pelvic, right? So just different regions. Really nothing too scientific about this other than just knowing where areas go to, and that's why I would say anatomy is dry in the sense that it is just pointing and naming. Right? There's no secret about it. All you need to do is just look at it many, many times and try your best to download it into your long-term memory. All right, so just showing you some different cavities, be able to identify them, and then dorsal cavity shown here in the indigo color. A closer up of the thoracic cavity, you can see that surrounding your lungs and your heart, you also have membranes. There's a theme in anatomy in the sense that everything in our body has a membrane. It has a layer, an outer layer, an inner layer, sometimes a middle layer. The outer layer is oftentimes used the term parietal. This is the outer coating, and then visceral is the inner layer. Right? So if we have the parietal pericardium, pericardium refers to the heart, outer layer of the heart. Visceral pericardium is the inner layer of the heart. But because it's around the lungs, we don't call it pericardium, we call it the pleura. So we have the outer parietal pleura, and then we also have the visceral pleura. Right? So again, a lot of times is you'll see that there are adjectives that are shared across the whole body, and then depending on what organ we're talking about, we have one noun used to describe that. Okay, so heart, pericardium, and then in the lungs we have the pleura, and we also have in the central region of the thoracic cavity the mediastinum, where it supports your trachea, your thymus, and your esophagus. Moving down to the GI system, we also have the abdominal pelvic cavity, where you have the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, right? So this is the colon, your large intestine. And then we have the mesentery, which is a layer of fat that supports the outer membranes of all these organs. And then we have the small intestine. And this last part of small intestine is called the ileum, which joins into the large intestine, right? So you'll see that it's anchored in here, and there's cavities that where they reside in, right? So that way when you're moving your GI system, you don't have your organs flopping around. And they're held in place because a lot of these are anchored to the cavity wall. So we have a couple of cavities here. We have the peritoneal cavity, which is included the visceral outer lining, inner lining of the peritoneum. This is the area where all these interior organs are attached to. And then we also have the superior cavity and then inferior cavity down in the bottom area towards the bladder, right? So this tells you region of where we're looking at. So this is another cool way to dissect the abdominal pelvic cavity. So you come in, a patient has pain in some part of the GI system, right? And it's hard to diagnose if you don't know where it's coming from. So a lot of times you'll be asked questions, the doctor will palpitate, and you'll do an x-ray, but obviously before you make any intrusive operations or cut anybody up, you want to have a pretty good area localized. And so this is two ways to look at the abdominal pelvic regions versus quadrants. They're both valid in terms of the healthcare field. And the regions, we have 9 regions. The upper right hypochondriac, upper left hypochondriac, epigastric, this is going to be your stomach region, umbilical cord, umbilical region, left lumbar, right lumbar, right? So that's referring to the lumbar of the vertebrae of the backbones. And then we have the hypogastric below it, or underneath your stomach and towards the upper part of the bladder. And then we have the left and right iliac. For quadrants, though, it's a little bit easier. We can divide into 4, right? Instead of 9, we have 4. We have the RUQ, right upper, right lower, and left lower. So just remember when you're looking at a picture, right, the image on this picture, the right is on your left. Okay, so just remember, you always want to start off with anatomical position first. And one of the best tips I can provide you right now is when you go through anatomy, when you look at different pictures and models and different names of muscles and bones,